Good morning. This morning we have a really exciting opportunity as we have a guest speaker for our KO conversation, Broadway and opera star Janelle Robinson. So some of you might be thinking, why is she here? And I wanted to give you some ideas into how we got her here and the importance of why she's here. And that has everything to do with, I think this slide is right, yes. That has everything to do with our winter musical, Thoroughly Modern Millie. So upon a quick Google search of Thoroughly Modern Millie, you might find that there's some controversy around this show. So months and months and months ago, I put together a committee of some really fabulous people at the school who I have up here that I want to acknowledge. And we created essentially an essential question. How might we create an opportunity that recognizes our theater performances as a means of promoting student awareness, cultural competency, and courageous conversations in both an entertaining and educational manner within our community, with our desired outcome being create strategies to cultivate our productions in a mindful manner that is proactive in the before, during, and after process of artistic presentations to our community. So essentially, we can't just throw something up on stage and then we all go home and we don't talk about it or think about it. Ideally, we throw something up on stage with some education ahead of time, and then we go home thinking, wow, that really sparked conversation, or that really sparked thought, or I've never felt that way before, or I've never seen that before, and how do we handle that as a community? For those of you who have no clue what I'm talking about because you've never seen the show, which could happen and is happening, I wanted to read to you the synopsis. Set in New York City in 1922, Thoroughly Modern Millie tells the story of a young Millie Delmount from Kansas who comes from New York in search of a new life for herself. Her grand plan is to find a job as a secretary for a wealthy man and then marry him. However, her plans go completely wrong. The owner of her dingy hotel, a villainous failed actress who impersonates a Chinese woman, kidnaps young girls to sell them to the Far East. Her wealthy boss is slow in proposing marriage, and the man she actually falls in love with doesn't have a dime to his name, or so he tells her. And then this is like the sell of the show, filled with frisky flappers, dashing leading men, and a dragon lady, a villainess that audiences will love to hate. Thoroughly Modern Millie is a perfect constructed evening of madcap merriment. From explosive tap numbers, hopefully, to a Fred and Ginger routine on a window ledge, this is the perfect show for theaters that are looking to show off their dance skills for their performers. In Millie Delmount, musical theater has a new heroine for ages of Thoroughly Modern Millie. So I wanted to put up some of the characters. I'm not going to read these to you, but as we start to talk about these characters and you have no clue what we're talking about, if you've never seen the show, I want this to be a reference for you. So I want to introduce Janelle in the best way possible, so I wrote a little something that should take me 30 seconds to read. That'll give you some intro to who she is. Today we welcome Broadway and opera star Janelle Robinson to Kingswood Oxford. Janelle has performed extensively all over the United States and also internationally in Canada, France, and Japan. Her education speaks for itself. A bachelor's degree in opera from the Hart School of Music, a master in opera from the Curtis Institute, and an advanced certificate in voice at none other Juilliard. Her education granted her the ability to work professionally in TV, film, Broadway, and national tours. You may have seen Janelle in a number of episodes of Law & Order, or along with a national Febreze commercial, which you might find funny, but every time they play that commercial, Janelle's bank account goes a little bit higher, okay? So Febreze all day. On Broadway, she earned her equity card in the revival of Showboat, then she moved over to Oklahoma, and then Mary Poppins on Broadway, where she originated the role of Mrs. Corey and played that role for 7 years on Broadway, which is unheard of. She booked the national tour of Showboat after a Broadway revival, and then a decade later, booked Thoroughly Modern Millie, where she was the first and only woman of color to ever professionally play the role of Miss Flannery. She also understudied the role of Muzzy and Mrs. Mears, and this is a fun fact. In a week where several cast members came down with an extreme illness, Janelle covered both Miss Flannery and Muzzy, which was later named Fluzzy, in the same show for 7 performances. Also unheard of. Her career has brought her a number of awards, the Richard Tuckler Study Grant, the McAllister Award, and the Connecticut Critics Award, in addition to her passing on her knowledge to students as a teacher now at Western Connecticut State University, the Hart School of Music, and of course, Juilliard. She has performed on Broadway, on TV, in films, internationally, regionally, and so much more, and we're lucky that she is with us today to enlighten her experience within Thoroughly Modern Millie and to answer some of our burning questions in regards to our 2020 musical. Please help me in welcoming Janelle Robinson.
Thank you.
So I guess my first question before we go to some students and some faculty on the staff is, how did you get involved with the show? Like, how did it land in your life? And Thoroughly Modern Millie is such a big deal to us because we're doing it at our school, but how did it happen for you?
I had just finished the run of Oklahoma in New York on Broadway, and I had an agent at the time, and so I was auditioning for several shows, and Thoroughly Modern Millie had actually already, believe it or not, been cast, and they were in their first day of rehearsal, and they were looking for an understudy, a standby, for Muzzy and Mears on the tour. So while the cast was rehearsing in one room, I was auditioning in the other. And I got the call later that day that I was offered the job, and then we started, I started rehearsals, and they had originally cast the role of Mrs. Mears. The same actress was going to do Flannery, but they realized that that was physically impossible because of the timing. They would not be able to get their pretty extreme costume changes, and they wouldn't be able to get her from Mears and Flannery. So I filled in while she was in a costume fitting, and at the end of the rehearsal, the creative team came to me and they said, Janelle, we'd actually like you to take over the role of Flannery and do the role of Flannery for the tour and still cover the roles of Mears and Muzzy. So I was basically, yes, I got bumped in one day. And I also had to learn how to tap in 2 weeks because I really didn't tap. The only tapping I had done was in college for a semester. And as everybody knows, Flannery has that famous tap solo in Forget About the Boy. And so I was taught by Tony Yazbek, who was also on tour with me. He was in the ensemble. And yeah, so I learned how to tap in 2 weeks for our opening in Green Bay, out-of-town run.
Awesome. So we have a question from Miss Edwards. I'm going to pass the mic.
Good morning, Janelle.
Good morning.
So my question, I think for many people, I don't know anything about the musical. So for audience members who do not know the musical, what common misunderstandings do you think they have? And part two would be, how would you guide them so that they get the full impact of what the musical has to teach us?
I think that if you don't know the musical at all, just looking at the title and the poster, you probably have no idea what it's about, and you wouldn't necessarily have any misunderstandings unless you Googled it or, you know, found some fake news out there or people's opinions, which is really what is out on the internet. But to look at the cast, you might have misunderstandings about the roles of Mrs. Mears and the roles of Muzzy, because if you're talking about 1922, you wouldn't realize in this day and age that a woman of color could be married to a white man at the time, or that a woman who would be impersonating a Chinese lady would be acceptable at the time. But the story itself is really about, it's really a love story is what it is. And the fact that Mrs. Mears is the villain and not the hero, if you just listen to the lyrics and the texts of the show as the show is happening, you will understand that it actually has nothing to do with what we preconceive as racist issues. I mean, Mears is a racist, but she also is the villain, and she does not win at the end. And that's really what, as far as that storyline goes, that's what's important. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if I could follow up a little bit on what you just said.
Yeah.
We at KO, we've been talking a lot about the difference between representation and endorsement. Mm-hmm. So I think you were just getting to that when you said Mrs. Mears is the villain she's very racist, but she suffers a bad fate. So are there any other ways in which the play, the musical, in your opinion, sort of indicates to the audience that it does not support the racist or sexist portrayals that are happening on stage? How does the musical itself show us that it's not endorsing those things?
Sure. So first of all, Millie goes to New York to have a career and to marry her boss. And one of the early scenes in the show, she's in the office interviewing with Mr. Graydon, and she's being all sexual and provocative, and she's acting in a certain way. And Mr. Graydon completely ignores this. And we later realize that she has no intention of wanting to be with him. She realizes that, love is what's more important than money or getting, the person who she originally thought that she should be with. So the whole sexual aspect of that. Also, Jimmy, who comes across as a player, as we would say nowadays, in the show, he also reveals himself later in the show as to be a person of substance and is not interested. There's a scene where they go into this speakeasy, and there are a lot of opportunities for him to end up with any girl, and he ends up with Millie, who is not as provocative in that scene. So dealing with, that issue, but also, what was the other part of your question?
About gender and racism.
Right. So as far as racism, as I said before, Muzzy was portrayed in the show with an African-American woman, and she is the one actually who has the most poignant and important monologue in the whole show, because she speaks to Millie about what is going to fulfill her and how she will find her true happiness. And she says she has this wonderful monologue where she talks about how she met her husband, who actually ended up being the multimillionaire. But when he first met her, he portrayed himself as a poor person who was just going out to a club, and he didn't have much to offer her. And she fell in love with him, not his money. As far as the issue of portraying people who are racist or have racist ideas, Bung Fu and Ching Ho are helping Mrs. Mears because they have a concept and an idea that they are going to be reunited with their mother. And that is the only thing that drives them. That's all they want. They do not understand, I don't believe, what Mrs. Mears is trying to do. We all get in situations where we are faced with adversity and decisions that we have to make that are not always easy. And I believe truly in my heart that that's the situation that they are in that in the hotel with Mears. They want to be reunited with their mother, and they will do whatever they can to make that happen. But once again, in the end, they actually go against Mears, and they choose not to follow her directions and send the girls off. So their moral ethic code, outshines their willingness.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in musical theater, the only person of color is usually a villain or a maid, but in Thoroughly Modern Millie, the only person of color, well, not person of color, African American, is this wealthy superstar, and she's basically like shown as being this great person. So how is that like groundbreaking or just like plain refreshing to see?
I would say it is both groundbreaking and refreshing to have the role of Muzzy portrayed as a black woman who ends up being actually the hero in the musical. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot because I'm going to go back to Muzzy and her speech. But unfortunately, there was a lot of history in the musical theater canon of minorities being the villain or the evildoer or the downtrodden in the history of musicals. That comes out, though, if you do your homework, you'll realize that in America, the history of theater came from minstrels, the minstrel world. And that was when white people portrayed black people in blackface. And then eventually, and that was because black people were not allowed on stage. It was illegal. And then eventually, black people were allowed on stage, but they had to portray themselves in a degrading way. They had to portray themselves as slaves or mammies or whatever, and also wear blackface on their black faces. So, when a show like Thoroughly Modern Millie comes around, and we have a creative team that decides, no, we're not going to cast a white woman like the movie in which Carol Channing portrayed Muzzy. They decide that they're going to put a woman of color. I would say that that is a step in the right direction, because you are actually looking beyond the color of a person's skin and saying that the individual is doing the right thing, is the hero. And how can we expound on that? How can we make that even greater? Well, if we cast a woman of color in that role, then we're making another communication. We're saying something else as well. And that's an opportunity. I think that since then, like Millie in a way was kind of groundbreaking, because since then we've had a lot of shows where they call it colorblind casting, but it's gone even beyond that. I mean, we have Hamilton, where who is there anybody in this room that does not know the show Hamilton? Anyone? Okay. Well, you should do your homework. Go online. You can't miss it. But, you know, Hamilton is a story about our history here and the Constitution, and it is portrayed, all the characters are portrayed by people of color on stage, except for the king. And so we have come quite a long way with regard to that. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about those actors that you described who had to, on top of their black faces, add more blackface and then act in ways that were degrading and such. And so my question is about, how do you stay with difficult emotions when you're acting a scene that you find personally offensive?
Okay. So as an actor, it is our job to tell the story. This is what I've signed up to do. If I decide to go to school for civil engineering or neuroscience or, I don't know, anything, culinary arts, I'm making a commitment to myself and to the craft. It is the same thing when you're an actor. You make a commitment to your craft. There's going to be a lot of stuff that comes at you, a lot of shows, a lot of work that comes at you that may be controversial. There's going to be a lot of stuff that comes at you that's fluff. And you have to decide and distinguish which works for you. What is important to you, to your integrity, to do the work or not do the work. There are people that take jobs. I'm sure Anthony Hopkins was not interested in staying a serial killer when he did Silence of the Lambs. I'm sure that there are a lot of people that have taken roles in which they are portraying not very positive or seedy characters, despicable, heinous people. Liam Neeson in Schindler's List. That's another one I think of immediately. But what you're doing is you are telling the story, and in telling the story, hopefully enlightening your audience so that they leave asking questions. They leave wanting to know more about whatever it is that they just saw. They want to go home and have conversations with other people about this. They want to learn more about this. I can't tell you the amount of people that I've met in my life that have left a show and said, you know, after I saw that show, oh my God, I was so interested in that subject matter. I was so interested in what was happening on that stage. I ended up like going and researching, and I did all this work to find out. I got involved. People get involved in certain subjects as a result of seeing theater. So it's really, when I am on stage, you know, if I'm on stage, I did the revival of Showboat. And in the original production of Showboat, the word nigger was used many times in the show. And it was very offensive. And the creative team decided in the revival that they were not going to use that word. They changed it. They changed it to colored folk. Is colored folk better? I don't know. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. But you're telling a story and you are trying to evoke the character as well as impress on your audience the importance of what it is that you're trying to say.
So we've talked a lot about the show and the messages it has, the messages it sends to the audience. So could you speak a little bit to why it's so important to perform Thoroughly Modern Millie in our current climate, particularly in a high school setting like ours?
Sure. I think that high school is actually a great place to perform Thoroughly Modern Millie because it does start the conversation. This is why we're here right now, okay? We are here right now having this conversation because of the storyline of Thoroughly Modern Millie. If this were, I'm trying to think of a show that's just fluffy and light. Legally Blonde, okay? If this were Legally Blonde, we wouldn't be here for this reason. We might be here for other reasons, but not for this reason. And I think that the importance of doing a show like this is because it has one look at the issues of portraying a woman who is portraying a Chinese woman, a white woman portraying a Chinese woman trying to sell girls in the slave trade. So it opens up the conversation for what is slave trade? What is going on in the world back then? What is happening right now? Is that still happening? Is that still an issue in our community? In Connecticut, it's a huge issue, you guys. You have no idea. You could be in a store next to someone who has gone through something like that themselves and not even know it. And so doing Thoroughly Modern Millie, besides the fact that it has amazing dance numbers, I love the dance numbers in this show. But besides that, it really allows you to talk about racism and sexism, all the important issues that I think are very, very present and on the surface in today's world, especially with the polarity in our country right now. And not to get too political, but because we are right in the beginning of a serious political race, I think that it is really important that you ask yourselves these questions and say, what is it that's important to me? What do I want to see this country looking like moving ahead in the next 4, 5, 10, 20 years, my lifetime? What do I want for my world moving forward?
So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about why it's important that students have the opportunity to see art and musicals that help provoke thought about controversial issues like Thoroughly Modern Millie.
Okay, so if you were to go see a show in New York or regionally here, we have some great theater in Hartford. Hartford Stage, Theater Works, Playhouse on Park. There's so many theaters here. You would have the opportunity to look at a situation, to be presented with a situation in a more lighthearted, not that it's sugar-coated, because it definitely is not, but you're going to a show with the understanding that, oh, this is just a show, right? When we watch the news, most of us take the news at face value, regardless of whether it's real or fake. We watch the news on TV, or we listen. Most of you don't watch TV anymore. You watch your computer screens or your phones. But we understand it to be real. That's what we believe, okay? If you listen to reports, you will listen to people all over the country that really believe what is coming out of people's mouths on the news stations, okay? Regardless of whether it's true or not. When you go see a show, you have the opportunity to see that information, to receive that information in a way that is a form of entertainment. So then you can leave there and you can decide for yourself, oh, do I want to buy into that? Does that interest me? If you go see Cabaret at, I think Playhouse did it a few years ago, and that show deals with the situation in Europe and Jewish people in Europe being condemned. You can leave there with knowledge of something, but not having it being sensationalized. So you have the opportunity to digest it yourself, think about it, and then make a choice. And I think that entertainment is not only just to, there are lots of pieces that, you sit back and you're just entertained. But hopefully there is a message being given within any of these pieces. And hopefully, if you are paying attention, you will go home and continue thinking about it.
So we have like 1 minute left. And we have two questions left that I want to condense. So Frank wanted to ask you, how are Asian or Asian American actors usually portrayed in musical theater? And how is this different than how they show up in Thoroughly Modern Millie?
Okay, quickly.
And our friend Cecilia wanted to ask, what's the big takeaway from this show? Especially, we're noticing in this show that every single minority wins at the end of the show.
Well, you just answered that question, so I don't have to answer that one. So, Asians in the music theater canon, most of the time, other than the Flower Drum Song, most of the time they are portrayed in a kind of a negative way. If you think about The King and I, a white woman comes and saves the country, saves the king, who was played by a Russian man, by the way, Yul Brynner, not Asian, okay? South Pacific was a country that white people went to, and the guy fell in love with her, but then he couldn't be with her because she was Asian. He had to leave. We have many Miss Saigon. White soldier goes over, falls in love, impregnates her, leaves. Okay? Are you getting the pattern here? Okay, so let's now talk about Thoroughly Modern Millie. Thoroughly Modern Millie, Bung Fu and Ching Ho, very honest, naive young boys. All they want to do is get their mother over to America with them. And during the time period, that was an issue, as you can all do your research and find out about the Chinese situation back then. Anyway, these characters are being portrayed in a realistic way. They are truly themselves. First of all, they're able to sing a song in their own language, which is unheard of in the music theater canon. Like, it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. It didn't happen prior to that. You don't have someone in South Pacific singing in their native language, correct? You don't have the King and I. I don't believe the King and I, the King ever sings in his language. He always sings in English. But these two characters are two innocent men, boys, that simply are wanting one thing, to get their mother over. And then at the end of the story, one falls in love, and it's true love. And he is able to, Dick Scanlon said specifically that when they speak, they do not speak in the stereotypical American way that we would portray Asian people. He says, I love you. He doesn't say, I love you. Okay? Which is what would be done earlier in earlier portrayals of Asian Americans or Asians in musicals. But the creative team was very specific in that. They wanted to make sure that that was not how they were portrayed, that they were portrayed as real people. And that's exactly what happens in this show, which is why it's so important that despite the show and like the jazz hands and everything in Moochie, it is still coming from a true, real self.
Thank you so much, Janelle Robinson. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. You are
Thanks, you
dismissed. Thank
guys.
you.